the most fundamental tool skill that we teach at Evoke Therapy programs. And I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about communication theory and communication skills when we teach it is that its value is simply on its surface, that it's about communicating how somebody feels. Tonight, I'd like to dive a little deeper into what's underneath it, what theories, what psychology is it connected to. I talk about this idea all the time that when I was first trained as a therapist and we were studied and introduced to communication theory and communication skills training, I thought that this was an overly simplistic model. I thought that it wouldn't have a lot of practical application. I was interested in the much deeper aspects of psychology, of analysis, of diagnostics, of treatment. And of course, what I found out in my practice and in various settings was that oftentimes this is what it looked like. And that while the principles might elude us, while we might not have access to them when we're under stress or in a difficult dynamic or situation or an exchange, if we go back to and rely on communication principles, they often can take us to a healthier relationship, healthier connection. So they themselves don't do all the work, right? Communication skills, it's not the thing that does it. But this is what it can look like. And communication skills and communication skills training can inform us about what's going on in psychology. So some of the questions tonight are about, why don't I do this? Why can't I do this? Why would I be resistant to doing this? Why am I not inclined to do this? So I'll talk about all of those aspects. This is going to be a full hour tonight, and I'll talk about the various levels as we go throughout them. And I'm going to give you the basics and also the deeper stuff. Metacommunication is a concept that is what is really being talked about. Early aspects of training as a therapist, you learn to hear the difference between what is said and what is meant, right? So when you look at something on its surface, when you look at a transcript of a conversation, it might not be telling you the entire truth. And that's why, as a therapist, I think a lot of people become concerned, of course, with how the therapist perceives them, especially when you're doing family or couples counseling, because they assume that the therapist might be listening to things on their face value, when really we're paying attention to what is really happening in the situation. So metacommunication is that look deeper into the process, not just the content of what's being talked about, but what is really happening here. And I think we don't always have access to those things. A couple of reasons. One is our training gives us access to those things. But I can even tell you, in my own marriage, in my own family, I lose access to what's really going on. I have the objectivity to step outside of it. And that's why we in our family, through the entire course of my family, we use family therapists. We use outside professionals to help us to get clear about what's going on in our family. So it's not just about that I or any therapist knows more than you do, but it's about that all of us can benefit and find value in having somebody help us understand what's going on in our relationships. Thinking about what's really happening in a communication model, I have a couple of concepts. Pathology, addictions, neuroses, and symptomology often have their roots in the unexpressed emotional pain of the individual. Or as Carl Jung said it, neuroses is a substitute form of legitimate suffering. We use communication theory to help equip individuals and families with tools that facilitate feeling, healing, and integration. The feeling statement, for example, the very simple statement, is an avenue to feel, to connect, to choose, and change. I'm going to say that last sentence again. The feeling statement is an avenue to feel, connect, choose, and change. So it's not just about helping somebody understand you. And by the way, just because somebody understands you doesn't mean that they're going to change in the way that you hope they will. I think that's one of the mistakes that both parents and children and spouses make with each other. If I explain myself well enough, if your understanding will be that you'll change and give me what I want. That's not the purpose of communication theory of communication training. I'm going to talk tonight about a couple of models, the wellness cycle and the shame cycle, and how they fit into that. And I'll start with this very general concept. There's another broadcast on the wellness cycle that goes more into depth, but I'll just give you this basic concept that is common to the very premise of psychotherapy, that most people adhere to, no matter what their background. There's this idea that we have a state of contentment, right? A starting point. It can be arbitrary, but you can think about it as birth, right? Or any moment where you're feeling serene and peaceful. And of course, there are desired experiences that happen to us. And with those desired experiences come positive emotions. And then there are undesired experiences that come to us. And with those undesired experiences come undesired emotions. So from those experiences, and everybody has some, and as a parent, we become tempted to make judgments about what somebody should be feeling. And we don't get to decide that. We don't get to decide what is trauma, what is hurt to somebody else. In fact, the very idea that we have that we can decide that for somebody else becomes oftentimes a departure into a problem, right? It becomes the starting point of a problem. So at the core of this point, what happens at this point is when we have these undesired emotions, we distract from them. We medicate them, numb them, right? At the base of all of this is hurt and sadness and fear, anxiety, insecurities, pain, right? That's what's at the core of it. And what we do to cover that up is anything from substance abuse to disordered eating to lying to suicidality, right? Sexual acting out, self-injury, fighting, violence, on and on and on, school problems, right? All of those things, like Carl Jung suggested, all of those behaviors serve us to not feel. We have this idea that pain is a problem in our culture. We're naturally aversive to pain. And so when we find something that works to make us feel better, we're more likely to repeat that. And if we're genetically loaded in certain ways, we're incredibly susceptible to that becoming a strong or addictive pattern in our life. So how do we get out of it? And the idea is that we learn to tell our story. We learn to talk about how we feel. The classic therapist question of how do you feel? How do you feel when that happened? It's not so much that we're looking for how you felt, like that information is important or vital or central to somehow curing some illness, but we're really teaching you how to feel. And the vehicle that we have to teach you how to feel is to talk about it, tell the story. If we could say to you, just feel, and that would work, then we would say that. But in reality, the best way we have to do that is to ask you to talk about the story. And then, of course, out of that becomes a feeling. Out of that experience becomes something that you learn to feel, something that you go through, right? In order to move through, to release our pain, we have to learn to honor it. We have to acknowledge its presence. I remember in early therapy, there was a workbook that we used to work on. And in this workbook, there was this idea that there was this one drawing where it talked about grief experiences, painful experiences, and there was this arrow that got blocked, and any other way of going around it caused symptoms. Any other path but through it caused symptoms. So we learn to talk about it. We learn to tell our story. We can do that in therapy. We can do that in a group setting. But in the end, we learn how to feel, and we pass through it. And then there's this sense of integration and wholeness. I listened to something incredibly profound the other day. I watched a TED Talk of Elizabeth Smart. Some of you may know her story. She was from Salt Lake City, and several years ago was abducted and then experienced an incredible amount of tragedy over a 9-month period, was eventually found. And now she's a public speaker and teaching about it. And some of you know the story, and I'd invite you to go and Google Elizabeth Smart and her TED Talk and watch her story. But she said something amazing at the end of the TED Talk. She said she would not wish this on anybody, not on herself or anybody else in the world, but that she was grateful for all that she went through, that she was richer for it. And I think that's a perspective about learning to feel our pain, learning to go through something difficult, that it can become part of who we are, can become part of our strength. It can give us greater empathy and sensitivity, less judgment, more patience for others. I think a lot of you have experienced that. So this is the idea, is stuff happens, and we can either medicate and distract from it or learn to feel. I used to say this to my children when they were young, and I was trying to explain to them what I did as a therapist, because it's kind of hard to explain to young children what you do. And I would say, I'm teaching the sad boys how to be happy, but really, I'm teaching the sad boys how to feel. We're teaching people how to feel. And by teaching them and giving them experience or a practice of feeling, they don't need the symptoms. They don't need the symptoms to cover them up, as they're capable of. And I think wilderness therapy, in a very powerful, primitive way, is the best delivery method I've ever seen for this kind of work. I want to talk about, just touch on the shame cycle. There's an entire broadcast dedicated to it, but shame often is the barrier to communication. Right? There's a lot of shame that gets in the way of us being able to tell our story, to talk about what's going on, to express our feelings, right? And this cycle examines this idea that children, that the clients that we work with, the participants we work with, can oftentimes say a lot of the right things. Say they're sorry, say that they'll never do it again, promise, acknowledge that they've made mistakes. And in the early phases of the program, not all of them, but many of them respond that way. But eventually we wind up at the exact same place. Because therapy isn't about getting in trouble. It's not about healthy shame or healthy guilt. Right? If you go into a doctor with a ruptured tendon in your knee, you're not in trouble or bad. If you have a psychological symptom, you're not bad or wrong. Something's just broken. And so this template that sometimes we think about the work that we do in therapy and psychology is that it's about behavior. It's not that. It's something that's broken, that's injured, that needs healing, that's a sore, that's a wound. And so I wanted to touch on this for just a moment, to say this can become a barrier to honest communication. This can become a barrier to feeling, this idea of shame. When our clients, when our participants spend a lot of time apologizing, it's not often the thing. It's not about what they did to everybody else. Yes, they did hurtful things to other people in their life. Yes, they lacked sensitivity and empathy with their loved ones. That's a part of it. But that shame, that guilt that comes, it's not going to be an effective long-term fuel for change. Because in a moment of anger, of resentment, they're going to be tempted to go back into that place. So I just wanted to touch on that for a second. Things to remember in communication: simple but hard. You know, I can easily diagram a healthy conversation with my wife or my children if you were asking me to do it clinically or academically. That doesn't mean that it's easy. It takes strength and vulnerability. It takes a willingness to feel something, to look at oneself. And so this is, again, one of the reasons that I've come to value communications theory, communication skills training, is because in those difficult moments, I can still imagine the ideal. I know what it looks like to listen to somebody who's expressing anger, frustration, hurt directed at me. I know what it looks like. And when I'm unable to do that, over time, through a process, I can look at what's getting in the way. It's much deeper than you imagine. I joke about this sometimes, that I thought to myself when I was first training, I thought, I'm glad they have communication skills. I literally thought this sitting in graduate school, thinking really highly of myself. I thought, I'm glad they have this kind of training for some of the simple-minded therapists, because I'm going to do deeper, more complex work. But I'm glad that they have something for them. And then, of course, I was humbled later to realize that complex discussions, dialogue, and analysis, for myself and for others, oftentimes didn't resolve everything. Sometimes I needed some tools, both as a participant and also as a therapist. Be careful of shortcuts or behind the back passes, right? Learn the fundamentals. Great coaches in sports, for example, great teachers in the arts require their students, their pupils, to master the fundamentals. And the more we master the fundamentals, the more capable we are of creativity. So I used to say it this way. For the first, let's say, 20 or 30 years, try it this way. Don't get clever. I think it's so easy, like I shared with you about my own initial reactions to this. It's so easy to think that I'm better than this, that I don't need this. But going back to that over and over again can be helpful. I think people will complain that it feels contrived, it feels unnatural, but in a way that's good. When something comes in that's uncomfortable, that's outside of the norm, that's outside of our comfort zone, it interrupts old habits and patterns, right? When I go for a golf lesson, sometimes the golf instructor will observe something in my stance or in my grip on my golf club, and they'll adjust it. So, and at first, when they adjust my grip, for example, which is a very basic thing, how I'm holding the golf club or tennis racket, when they adjust that, my first response is, this feels horrible. This feels so unnatural. I'm not going to be able to make effective, powerful contact with the ball. And of course, they patiently just tell me to be quiet and start practicing my swing. And after a while, it becomes comfortable to me. So interrupting old patterns is okay. How do we interrupt old habits and patterns? We just do it the new way. We find these new ways to communicate rather than what feels comfortable. Like I said, sometimes we think it's simple, too simple, and it's beneath us. Pablo Casals, one of the greatest cellists of his day, was playing the scales up until the day that he died. And somebody asked him, why do you play the scales? You're the greatest cellist of all time, of your era. And he said, I learn something new every day. Right? Great artists, great athletes, great anything. Master the fundamentals and go back to it again and again. It's okay to cheat, right? To look at your notes. Don't be too proud to look at your notes. This is not a test of your memory. Here's an amazing thing about the communication model. When students or clients come to our program, of course, much of this is new to them. We have an I feel statement that I'm going to go over later that many of you are familiar with. Some of you might not be. And we ask them to kind of adopt our version of it, to use our version of it while they're with us in the program. And particularly the listening skill is very difficult or challenging to them. Right? They can't hear anybody else because they're doing what most of us do. They're preparing a rebuttal, an argument, a defense. And after about 2 weeks, after practicing the skill, they become masters at it. Their parents might come out to the wilderness week 5, 6, 7, or 8, watch the group, watch their son or daughter, and be amazed with how well son or daughter does this, practices, demonstrates the skill. But when you start off, it's okay to do it kind of rigidly and simplistically. Right? Practice the fundamentals so that in a moment of stress, that's what you fall back on instead of practicing the behind the back pass. Like I say, stick to the format just for the next 20 years. Practice the format. After that, get creative. Give it a chance to teach you something. Right? It has in it elements that I'll describe tonight that are really amazing psychological and relational principles. I think a lot of us adults think that therapy often is going to be, we're going to develop this insight or have this aha moment. I have parents ask me about their children in that way all the time. Have they figured this out? What's the new insight? What have they learned? And while those are an exciting and valuable part of our therapy, sometimes behavior change, sometimes the skills that we are asked to practice can change us just as much, right? The structure, like I share in my book, from a quote I saw from George Orwell in my 10th grade English class. If thoughts can corrupt language, then language can corrupt thought. In other words, if what we think can affect what we say, which is obvious to everybody, then what we say can affect what we think. We learn to think differently. I had a father years ago that was trying to respond to his son. This father was working on his codependency. His son was a very significant, dangerously ill drug addict. And the father was trying really hard to work on his codependency. So we were giving him some of the skills and asking him to not use certain words, the words that we ask you not to use in the hopes and intentions letter, for example. We ask that of your children all the way throughout the program. We ask that of you for the next 20 years or so. And this father on the phone with me was trying to formulate a response to something his son had said in the letter. And he kept on stopping himself halfway through his first sentence. And I observed this, listened to this, and I asked him, I said, what's going on for you? And he said, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to relate to my son right now. And I said, that's a good thing. You're thinking about it because you're trying to use the skill that we've asked you to use. You're thinking about it differently. You're going to change the relationship that you have with your son and his issues. We can all imagine the value that comes from just listening and when we get good at that. A lot of our students struggle with that initially. A lot of our parents struggle with that. I had a father tell me years ago, in the first couple of weeks of working with his family, with his son in the wilderness, he said, in my job, I have to listen. I'm a fantastic listener. He accused and had a lot of evidence his son of lying. Why would I listen to him? He lies all the time. About 4 or 5 weeks in, after practicing some of this, watching the webinars, reading some of the information, he said somewhere around week 4 or 5, he said, I realized I'm a horrible listener. Because he saw the deeper level, right? He saw the meta communication. And I said to him, you are so much a better listener now than you were when you thought you were good at it. In fact, the fact that you can see it tells me that you're getting it. You know, probably the biggest mistake that people make is that they use communication to try to change other people. I even hear staff and therapists all over the country talk about it in this way. Have you told them how you feel? And whenever I hear somebody ask that question of somebody, I don't always stop them, but I have the thought, and what's that going to do? What do you hope to get out of that suggestion that they tell mom or dad or spouse or child how you feel? I was sitting in a parent meeting many years ago where a father was describing the conversation with his son. His son had promised to help him do something on a Saturday morning, and then his son didn't want to wake up and was struggling. This is post-wilderness. And then the father went in, armed with the communication tool of the I feel statement, and told his son how he felt. And was getting a lot of reinforcement and praise from the group. And after listening to the story, I said, what was your goal? Because if you're using communication skills to get your child to change, that's not the intention. Your feelings are your responsibility. It's not your child's job to make you feel happy or proud or peaceful. In the field, I talk about it this way. Oftentimes, students will be asked to share I feel statements with each other in a group setting when somebody's frustrated with somebody maybe not participating in chores or something that happened that day. And if they're feeling cooperative that night or open to it that night, they'll share an I feel statement with their peer. If their peer happens to be open to it, they might even reflect it accurately using the skill. But it's not uncommon for somebody to turn to us and to say after such an exchange, what difference does that make? Not going to change. And my response is, you might be right. You probably are right. At least not anytime soon. They're not going to change. So what is the value of you articulating your feelings? say this before we go on. Because of this tendency for parents to share their feelings with their children toward the goal, toward the idea that they're going to get their children to change what they're doing as a result of it. I've over the years, and I haven't said this on a communication webinar specifically, I don't think ever. I've become more of an inclination. I've been more inclined to suggest that parents should really consider not sharing their feelings with their children. I don't want to make such an extreme statement that I think they ought not to. But because the tendency, the overwhelming tendency for parents is to parent from that place, I will tell you how I feel so that you will feel a responsibility to change your behavior to make me feel better. So I put this out there as a significant warning. If you adopt the communication skills tools, the ideas, with the intent to try to change how somebody feels, specifically your children, don't use it, don't share it. The staff member who, after the kids were walking all over the all of the plants out in the field in one specific area one night, came to me and said, "Hey, I'd like to call a group and share with the group how I feel." And I said, "Why? Why do you want to share with them how you feel?" "Well, because they're not following the rules of avoiding vegetation. They're killing lots of the life out here." And I said, "Well, how about if you call a group and just remind them of the rule and say if they don't follow it, we're going to have to move to a spot where there's less vegetation." But the staff was thinking, if I tell them how I feel, I'm upset, I value nature, right? I have these values in me, then somehow they're going to feel or ought to feel the same way. That's not the purpose. That's not the goal. It can have that effect at times, but it's not the way that we ask you to parent. So let's talk about the basic I feel statement. There are many different, this is simply ours. We start off with the I feel part. Some people start off with the part, but we start off with the I feel. We do that to emphasize ownership. It's my feeling. I feel this way. And if the third word out of your mouth is like or that, I feel like or I feel that, you're not sharing a feeling, you're sharing a thought. So it's I feel and then an emotion. I feel this way when is the second part, and then you describe an event. Ideally without a lot of interpretation and judgment, right? I feel this way when you walk out of the room when we're talking. Not, I feel this way when you give up on me, or when you reject me, or when you get mad at me, right? Those are all interpretations of you walking out of the room. But try to describe the event as objectively as possible, like a camera, like a video recording is making a recording of it. I feel scared when you walk out of the room when we're talking. I feel this way because I think, I believe, right? This is the underlying thought that leads to the feeling. We don't start with that, but that's what's underneath it. I feel scared when you walk out of the room when we're talking. I feel so because I think you're going to give up on me and we're not going to have resolution. Or you don't care about me. You don't value me, whatever it is. This is your thought. Your thought. And then there's a two-part hope for myself and hope for others. I hope in the future for myself, this is something that's inside of my control. I hope I can communicate assertively and patiently, not escalate. And I hope in the future for others, for you, for the other person, this is something outside of my control. And what I hope for you is that you'll come back and talk to me or stick with me when it's difficult. We had a discussion when we were first starting our program 20 years ago. And the discussion was, should we even include the hope for others, the thing outside of one's control? And part of the argument, one side of the argument was, we don't want to use the I feel statement as a manipulation tool. But what I thought was, the unspoken desire or hope is not more manipulative. Excuse me, the unspoken desire or want or request is not less manipulative, it's more manipulative. But the overt, explicit, spoken hope for somebody else, is most often less manipulative. I'm putting it out there. This is what I hope. It's outside of my control. Another aspect of these hopes is this first one about what's inside of my control. I've done this literally hundreds and hundreds of times at parent support groups and parent meetings in my career. And when I get to this part about what I hope that's inside of my control, often parents draw a blank. Think of a very classic I feel statement that you might give to your child. I feel scared when I see you. I'll just pick something simple like drinking. I feel scared when I see you drinking every day or to excess. I feel this way because I think it might be a problem with your health, with your emotional growth. It's easy to hope hope for something outside of your control. What I hope is that you'll stop drinking or look at this or be open to sobriety, right? You could say those come pretty easy. But then what is the hope inside of your control as it relates to this? And parents are often frozen or paralyzed at this point. It's like they can't even imagine in the exchange that there's anything relevant to this that's inside of their control. Now, I'm picking on parents, but I've seen it with spouses, I've seen it with children, I've seen it with all kinds of groups. But it's a good reminder to think, what is inside of my control? What can I do? And what can't I do? And oftentimes, people get it wrong. What I hope is inside my control is that you'll trust me. Well, that's not inside of your control. What's inside of your control is being honest. So you could say, I hope that I can be honest. So little things like that illuminate what's going on inside of us. And then the other side of the equation is you learn to listen. Deep listening, reflective listening, active listening. We happen to call ours reflective listening. And you simply repeat back, summarize back. So what you're saying is, and you paraphrase back without judgments, exaggerations, interpretations in it. Paraphrase it back. It's okay to ask the person for help. This is not a test. And if you're like most human beings, you're going to be triggered or distracted or thinking about a response, which is not listening. I heard one person say not too long ago that the opposite of listening is waiting. Right? Waiting to speak, waiting to respond. So it's okay to ask for help because you're going to forget things, especially when you're new to it. And then you ask them if you got it right. Did I get it right? Was there anything else that I missed? And then if you miss something, they say it, and then you repeat it back again. Go back to the beginning. You reflect it again, and you ask them, did I get it right this time? And you keep doing that. And sometimes having it reflected brings up new ideas for the speaker, for the sender. So it's a thing you do together. And also the practice of reflective listening. I mean, I've been doing it for a lot of years, but this set of skills is something I use every day, all day, with my clients particularly, and also with my children and with my wife. It's the grain of life, of relationships. Listening, being clear, owning my emotions, right? All of those principles are embedded in these skills. Now I have a few set of principles that go deeper and deeper into it. I call these the 400 series. Setting up for success. The first thing I talk about is stating the intent. Here's what I want to, I'm going to share something with you. I just said this to my wife yesterday. Something happened and I said, look, I'm not really upset, but I want to share something with you that bothered me. Can you listen? And that sets her up for success. Then she knows that's her only job. And she gets to say no. I can think of times when both of us have said to each other, I have something I want to share with you. Are you in a place where you can listen? And in many cases, we've said to the other one, not right now. Feelings are more intense. Feelings are raw. One of us is depleted. And then we come back to it at a later moment. Ask the sender what their intent is. What would you like from me? I think this skill is one of the most overlooked skills in All of relationships. When somebody is sharing something with you, ask how you can be helpful. Do you want me to just listen? Do you want me to share with you my thoughts or what I hear? Do you want me to help you problem solve this? Do you want suggestions? What would you like? And then if you can do what they're asking for, you do it. You tell them you can do it and you do it. Do something new, something uncomfortable, something that is a little unnatural, might feel a little bit contrived, right? Most skills, most basic fundamental skills in most areas of life feel a little contrived. Remember that it's not for behavior change. I've been clear about that. This is not getting somebody else to change. It helps us to avoid rescuing, talking somebody out, dismissing somebody's feelings. One of the things that I think people have some of the hardest time seeing is how easily it is slip into a response that discounts what somebody is feeling. Sometimes we think we're doing it to be helpful, like problem solving, or giving them a look on the bright side speech. But all of those kinds of responses, often anything but just keeping your mouth shut, is dismissive. It promotes differentiation, right? I'll talk about it a little bit tonight. I talked about it on Monday when I talked about family systems. But this is what intimacy looks like, right? Two people listening to each other, owning their own stuff, communicating clearly and assertively, their wants, their awareness. It's a way that, I could talk about healthy differentiation, healthy intimacy. But this is kind of what it looks like. This is the operationalization of it. It improves the relationship. And I talk about this idea of hearing and selecting the I feel statement. In other words, what if you could imagine somebody talking to you in a less than assertive way? Do you have the capacity to translate that into the I feel statement, right? Somebody yells at you, somebody gets passive aggressive with you. Can you have the capacity in that moment to say they are feeling scared or frustrated and angry? Can you reflect it or merely just hear it in your mind so that you don't become triggered and reactive to it? The 200 series. Returning the I feel statement with another I feel statement. This is a classic response. I say in the book, and I've said this for years, there needs to be a pause in between somebody giving you an I feel statement and you giving one. Sometimes that pause is a moment. Sometimes it's several minutes, an hour, days, months, years. It's not defined by the time. It's defined by, have we given enough space, or are we just going to do battle using these new tools? So give it a pause. Even respond with, are you ready to hear what I'm feeling? But there's a pitfall in that, because most people will say yes, because most people are comfortable with conflict and think that that's closeness, and it's not, of course. Reacting to the I feel or clarifying facts. It's just like the most common, right? No, I didn't say that. No, that didn't happen. Let me clarify that. That's not what I meant. That's not what was going on for me. If you wait for that and put it in its place after the I feel statement is honored, it may work. But it most often doesn't matter. And oftentimes, I've shared stories where people have shared an I feel statement with the other person that didn't agree at all with the premise or the facts of it. But after they felt heard, they came more toward the middle, closer towards what each other felt what was a more accurate representation. So give it space. It's just what somebody feels. Do your best to avoid imperatives. Those are the have to, must, need to, ought to, should, good, bad, right, wrong. Exaggerations are thinking errors, right? Those become ways to kind of weaponize the I feel statement. After giving an I feel statement, ask for a reaction and be open to the response. Be clear. If this devolves into a back and forth, into an argument, you're not ready to hear each other. You're just not. So be really aware of, are you really wanting a response where you want to hear it and you can just hear it. And most people that I've worked with overestimate their ability or where they are in that part of the process. 300 series. The difference between behaviorism and connection, right? There's two things that are going on in our work with our children and our work with family, and that is we're trying to work with and change dangerous, unhealthy symptoms. But the I feel statement exchange between parent and child is not principally directed to that, right? It's not, I don't tell you how I feel. So a lot of people, like I said, make that mistake. Be aware that questions are questions or statements are statements. I've been listening to a lot of the political rhetoric over the past several days, of course, as I'm sure some of you have. And I hear people ask the question, why? Why this? Why that? And I listen to it over and over again. I'm thinking, nobody really means why. There actually is an answer to that. But people don't mean why when they say why. They mean I don't like it, or I disagree with it, or I'm mad about it. So be aware, is your question a question? Or are you making a statement? And is your statement really a question? Be aware of the difference. That goes back to that concept of meta communication, the content versus the process. Repeating I feel statements. I used to say that one I feel statement on a topic is great. 2 is forgivable, and 3 is manipulation. And I've seen that with clients before. I've seen that in all kinds of relationships. Repeating the I feel statement over and over again. And I paused people and stopped them and said, what's the intent here? I've done that in my marriage. What, you said that already. I've reflected it back. What are you looking for that you're not getting? And most often it is, I'm expecting you to change, agree with me, like it, get on board. It's a, you know, the reflective piece that this exchange is a stepping stone toward empathy, which is a higher law, a higher principle. When you're first starting out, I ask the students to do this, especially with their parents. Be patient. Don't overcorrect. Listen to the spirit of the statement. You know, in the field, we teach the statement. We ask clients and students to use it. We ask families to use it. In a moment that's really raw, oftentimes I won't correct or intervene right at that moment. Sometimes I will. But if it's directed at me specifically, if it's at my family, I almost never will correct, unless, of course, I just want to fight. Then I'll correct all day long. But just try to hear really what's beneath it. And lastly, the 400 series. Be willing to stop, take a time out, quit, sleep on it, or otherwise interrupt it. Right? That feeling of being left dangling is so hard for people. We want our anxiety resolved, and if somebody won't resolve it with us, we find it unbearable. But it shows strength to be able to pause, to de-escalate. And I work on this, and I'm better than I used to be, and I still need to do better. But it's a really, really powerful tool just to slow down and stop. The principle of ownership, right? If I describe to you something I'm feeling that you did to me, right? It's my feeling. I've used the example that if I go to pat my friend George on the shoulder, and George kind of jerks out of fear because maybe he had been beat up by his older brother growing up a lot, his father, right? I didn't make George feel scared. That's George's fear. And George could share with me, right, his I feel statement about that. And he could ask me to not touch him without permission. And of course, I would be willing to do that in this example, right? You can ask me for things, and if I'm willing to do it. But we can also imagine situations where somebody shares a feeling statement with us where we're not willing to change. It's funny how to watch children. I remember a specific example with my daughter where it was highlighted. It was years ago, but it's just been this moment in my brain where I saw how it can be so confused, where my daughter was asking if the dog could get up on the couch. We had a big Rottweiler. Can he get up on the couch? And I said, no, not up on the couch. And she expressed some sadness and frustration with it, and it's not fair. She was a young girl. And I said, I know it's really hard, isn't it? Wouldn't it be fun if he could get up there? And then she thought, because I was listening and empathizing, she thought, oh, so I can? And I said, no, you can't, but I get it. And over time, and I see this in the program all the time, the children learn to distinguish between being heard and somebody expressing empathy toward them and agreeing with them. But we don't, in our families often, we don't in our natural growing up process see the difference. We equate them as the same. The natural or street I feel statements and reflections, right? It doesn't have to be formal every time, but don't be too quick to abandon this. Go back to it. I joke about use the kind of formal version for the next 20 years, because I'm saying most people oftentimes abandon it too early. And even if it goes on inside of your head, right? It's a way of thinking about life, about thinking about what we feel, what we believe, what we want, what's inside of our control, what's outside of our control. I talked about this in Monday. This is what the whole broadcast was about on Monday, about Mnuchin and Bowen, right? Mnuchin talked about boundaries between relationships, talked about enmeshment, disengagement, and clear boundaries. Bowen talked about fusion and cutoff, differentiation. This is what it looks like. It looks like two people connected, communicating, giving space for each other, holding each other in their mind with kindness and patience. So what's the goal? The goal is twofold. The goal is interpersonal differentiation and clarity, but it's also intrapsychic differentiation. What are the parts of me? What do I feel? What's my underlying belief about this event, this behavior? What do I want that I can control? What can I not control? Right? Can I tell the difference between an event and my belief about the event? If you raise your voice at me, that doesn't necessarily mean in your life, in your family, in your head that you're angry at me or that you don't love me. In my family, maybe it meant that. And can I start to understand that that's my belief, that's my reality? And this tool, stated or not, can help me get to that place. Some parents will say to me, some people will say to me, this is not good enough, it's not complete. My response is, it's oftentimes enough. We're just not used to it. It will be a change, and oftentimes not an initially celebrated change, but it is enough to be heard. Some people say, what if only one person is willing to do this? What if your child comes home and says, I don't want to use that anymore? I can remember early in my career using this with an uncle, a dear uncle of mine, after feeling hurt about something that happened between us. And him absolutely not having any of it, coming after me, insulting me, not responding to me, telling me I was crazy. And after it was over the phone, after hanging up the phone, my wife said to me, that didn't go well at all, did it? I bet you'll think twice before asking your students to use that skill. And I had to think about that. I had to think it didn't work the way I wanted it to. But I remember feeling a sort of peace, like I said my piece. I said how I felt, no matter how he reacted. So this skill works if one person does it. It's got to, because it's not for the other person. That's part of the benefit. But the main benefit is what goes on inside of me and the choice that comes out of it. See, in my earlier example, if I startle George by putting my hand on his shoulder because he had been abused, it's not a conscious choice. Feelings aren't a choice. He's not choosing to feel scared. But over time, if George does his work, in this example, he can, through a lot of work, choose out of it. But it'll take a lot of work to choose out of it. It'll take a consciousness. It'll take an awareness that not everybody who touches you is trying to hurt you. But that thing that happened to him isn't happening to him anymore, right? That's where the idea of choice comes out of it. But some I hear people say like we choose our emotions. That's not a reality. We don't consciously choose our emotions, but they can become a choice when we make them conscious and when we make them the content and focus of our therapeutic work. I already described the interpersonal and intrapersonal benefits. Trying to listen to what somebody is not saying. Right? That's the I feel statement. Learning, I had a student one time giving a speech to a group of parents in Southern California, and he said somebody asked him, what's the biggest benefit of this whole process that you've been through? He'd been home for a while, and he said, I can just hear what people are feeling and thinking from what they're saying, right? That's what happens in therapy after a while. What happens in the field is somebody says something very simple and passive or sarcastic or short with somebody else in the group, and you stop everything, and you have a standing or a sitting group, and you ask the person, what are you feeling? What's going on? And of course, their first response is nothing or it's no big deal, but you're patient, and you sit, and you ask again, and you wait, and they eventually talk about it. Sometimes it takes them days or weeks to talk about it, but they talk about it. And then after a while, everybody begins to understand something's going on underneath these words that we're using. Always. If I become aware of that, right, I become more of a master of myself, more empowered, more free, less a kind of victim to my own emotional world. It's not about you. The four agreements, Don Miguel Ruiz says that one of the agreements is don't take it personal. And he reflects on this and he says that no matter what somebody says about you, it's not about you. In Al-Anon, they say, what you think about me is none of my business. Right? And the better we get at this, the more grounded we get, the more okay we feel of it. That's the deeper work, right? If I know that I'm okay, if I know that I'm an okay father, an okay husband, an okay friend, and you come at me with feelings and anger and hurt, if I know that I'm okay, I just hear you. I just see you. I have compassion. I have grief for how I might have hurt you. I have empathy, patience, support, love. If I don't know that I'm okay, I defend it, I explain it, I make sure that you're talking to me perfectly. I point out that you need to own your emotions, right? I have all these wonderfully constructed defenses to dismiss the difficulty that it is for me to hear you because I'm not okay. I don't know that. So knowing that I'm okay, that's my work in therapy. That's all of our work in therapy. If we know that we're okay, just see each other. But until we get to perfectly knowing we're okay, we practice the I feel statement and the reflective listening skill. And when we stumble or struggle or avoid it or resist it or fail at it, we go back and we say, I'm not okay yet. My wife just quoted this the other day, that sometimes I pretend like when she's complaining about some hurt, some anger towards me, about me, something I've done, I pretend like she's talking about some other idiot husband. I was just in family therapy this week with one of my children, and they were describing things to me that I didn't agree with completely. But practiced at this, listened, understood, tried to see it from their side, didn't clarify, didn't correct. Right? Comes from this skill, comes from this work. And lastly, listen, 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 and know you're not doing a good job at this. I'm partly being funny, but my experience is that everybody, I look at my therapist of the last 19 years, the therapist that I've had, and I think she's the most gifted listener I've ever been with in my life, been around in my life, personally. And she's not perfect at it. And sometimes she gets triggered. So everybody can work on this. We can all do a little bit better at this. Another resource for this is Um, Nonviolent communication would be a deeper look at this kind of work. So, all right, I'm happy to take any live questions before we wrap up. If you point out an old pattern to your spouse, for example, and he accuses you of putting him down, what do? Just not say anything and engage in a different pattern yourself? Most of the time we don't respond well to having old patterns pointed out to us. So I would take you to the webinar, to the blog on the 8 tools for effective communication, um, where you share a thought or an idea. Don't do it in a hot, escalated, vulnerable moment. My therapist says, strike while the iron is cold. So, most importantly, it's like Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in the world. It's really easy to see somebody else's defense, somebody else's armor, somebody else's old patterns. And what they need most is love and patience in that moment. So if you can express that, and if they're open to it, great. If not, you apologize for stepping in where you ought not to have, back off and wait till they feel safe. That would be my thought. As a woman in an all-male household, I feel statements don't seem to be heard. How do I change that? I'm a teacher and I've been using this in my classroom, but in my house, I just keep trying to explain this? It's like that last page. It can help you. Obviously, folks, it's more ideal if 2 people in a relationship, or in this case, several people are using this. Okay, it's more ideal. But I walk around in the world knowing this skill, being okay at it at times, practiced at it for sure, good at it sometimes. On my great days, I'm really good at it for part of the day. And not many people are doing it. So it's tough. I can't take that away if you're the only one using it. But the only thing you can do is as they say in Al-Anon, is stay on your side of the street. Make invitations to others when they're not feeling vulnerable or raw or escalated or threatened. And many people are going to feel that way. So you're not alone. You're right. It's hard. Use it. Invite people to use it. Invite people to work on the skill with you, so forth and so on. And this person adds and says, perhaps I need to be a better listener. I love to talk. Get in line. We all find it easier than we do to listen. Now remember, the people in our lives that are doing unkind, unwell things are injured. Right? They're injured. They may be ignorant, not knowing. And so what that asks of us is our compassion. And that's hard to do. And that's why make sure you have a therapist. Make sure you have somebody you can talk to, who gets you, who can hear you. Going back to that previous question, it's something that's vital to our mental health. My therapist, I said she doesn't listen sometimes, but I can talk to her about that, and she always catches it. And if I point out that she's not listening, she's apologized 100% of the time. But I go to her because she can hear me. She can hear me and she can listen. What if I like to communicate about how I feel, but my spouse does not like to communicate about his feelings? It's similar to the last question. You're at a disadvantage in a relationship for sure. And for whatever reason, they don't. There's a nice question that comes into this, where it's more of a cultural shift in the family, but it's asking the question, what do I do that makes you feel unsafe? And they might not even answer that. But wonder that about yourself, right? If my teenage daughter or son doesn't say something to me, what am I doing that's making it not safe for them? I heard a podcast some time ago about leadership and a CEO, and he came to his group saying, look, I want to be more vulnerable. He called all of his managers together and he said, I want to be more vulnerable. I want to be more open. I want better communication to go all around, to come from the bottom up. And I'd like feedback. And then he said, Everybody looked at him with a blank stare and said nothing. And he thought to himself, there's my feedback. I'm not safe. So I think an idea, a concept is ask yourself in your life if people aren't talking. It's not all about you, right? They have their own wounds that predated you or that aren't about you. And that's true. But you don't have any control over that anyway. That's going to take a lot of unpacking and work for them. But always asking yourself, what can I do to be more safe, to listen better, to be a healthier, more capable container? When you give an I feel statement, I feel example and said, I feel this way when you walk out the door, aren't you trying to change their behavior to not walk out the door? Not necessarily, not innately, no. I might just be, like I said, I become more and more inclined to ask parents not to share feelings, but sometimes I'll say to somebody, it's not about you. Like, I get scared when you walk out the door, but that's not your problem. I just get triggered, and I've got to deal with that. That's why I yelled at you. That's why I gave you the silent treatment. That's why I'm feeling this, right? So sometimes in the middle of my I feel statement, I often say 2, 3, 4, 5 times, but it's not about you. You don't have to do anything about it. Sometimes children can't hear that, though. They can't not make it about them. So watch for that. Be reluctant, reticent, hesitant to give an I feel statement to somebody that you know, like a young child, who can't contain it, doesn't have the capacity. And sort that out with somebody else. I was working with my son today, him up in his dorm. When I saw him this morning, I could tell he was hungover. He is smoking pot and drinking. He also keeps bringing up his old friend group, the ones he was with before his wilderness program. I am trying to use my tools and listen, but I know my meta is coming through. How do I let go of the outcome? An I feel statement is not the right thing, I don't think. I think you're right. I'm glad you shared it tonight. Talk to your therapist. Talk to somebody else. Talk to your Al-Anon group. Right? Make sure that there's a place for that feeling. It's a valid feeling, but it's not his to carry. If you want to set a boundary, you can set a boundary. But handing others our emotions so that they're then obligated to make us feel differently is not theirs. And so I like your instinct. I like that you shared it tonight. But share it with your therapist, share it with your sponsor, your Al-Anon group, with other people. Make sure you stay on your side of the street. All right. No other questions for this evening. Thank you, folks. We ask all parents to attend 6 12-step support meetings while they're with us. Please do this. It can make a difference. It's changed people's lives. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous. You can go to their websites and look at meetings in your area. NAMI.org is a place you can go to find resources and classes in your area that are free or affordable. All of our broadcasts are available on the podcast app. So if you have an iPhone or an iOS device, that's an Apple device, you go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs and subscribe to us there. If you're on an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Evoke Therapy. Follow on Facebook, search Evoke Therapy Programs to follow us there. Find the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook. This is an organization that helps people that can't afford therapy. Search Second Nature Alumni Foundation. And then, of course, go to our blog for more information. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. You can also find an audio version through Audible or buy a CD on Amazon. The Parent Alumni Foundation book page is a place you can go to get recommendations for books on various topics, and a percentage of those proceeds goes to the charity to help people that can't afford therapy. Upcoming parent support groups, we've updated this a little bit. Nashville is Thursday, August 31st. New York City is Wednesday, September 13th. LA is Sunday, September 24th. The Bay Area, tentatively, it'll be Monday the 25th. In Washington, D.C., tentatively October 11th. Chicago, tentatively November 13th. And then Toronto, to be determined. If you have any questions or to RSVP, please email Andrea@evoketherapy.com. Intensives and workshops, we ask all current families to go to the workshop. This is a multi-group, experiential, educational, powerful experience. September 23rd through 24th at Entrada. You can combine that with a field visit to your child if your therapist believes that the timing is right. If you want to do deeper work, you can attend one of our Finding You intensives that I run. In Utah. We also do private intensives for families. Pursuits trips are private or scheduled trips. In fact, they're on a Nepal one right now. If you want to do sober fun, family adventure, think therapy light or sober fun. And then I will announce the next webinar in the next couple of days. All right, folks, thanks for joining us. I hope this is a helpful broadcast, a helpful reminder, a helpful point of contact. Have a great evening. Thanks for your participation and your questions. Take care and good night. Bye-bye.